Joining us now is John Horgan. John Horgan is the director of the Center for Science Writings at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. He is the author of The End of Science, The Undiscovered Mind and Rational Mysticism. He is also the author of a recent article on the scientific claims about meditation and his own experience with meditation. John Horgan, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So listen, I really enjoyed this article. I've written about meditation myself. I've kind of followed your writings and certainly followed the scientific debate on the virtues of meditation. So you did a very deep dive into the literature on meditation and the scientific literature, I should say. And what'd you find?
Well, I've written a lot about meditation and spiritual practices. My book, Rational Mysticism, which you mentioned, and came out about 12 years ago, was my attempt to go back to my youth when a lot of people in my generation were starting to meditate and practice yoga and chasing after all kinds of crazy gurus, and I was part of an ashram briefly that practiced Kundalini yoga, and so I've been interested in this stuff basically all my life. And I have lots of friends who are meditating, and I've seen the waves of enthusiasm for meditation come and go. And the enthusiasm lately has just reached this fever pitch. And it's been bugging me. A lot of the claims made for meditation. I mean, the hype has just gotten out of hand. And so I wrote this piece in a way to get some of this irritation out of my system. That's basically what I was trying to do.
Well, and I hope you did, first of all, for your own well-being. Secondly, it's interesting. You and I have parallel stories to a certain extent. Probably similar generations got into this stuff a while back, tried it in different iterations and so on. Now, I wrote a piece a while back that got me a lot of blowback, talking about more or less the economic and political subtext of some of this hype about meditation, which you touch on also in your article, but you really emphasized in greater detail as part of your exploration, the scientific literature, and it sounds like you found that there's not a lot of evidence for the exaggerated claims that are being made. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so I make an analogy in my piece between the scientific literature on psychotherapy and the literature on meditation. So I've tracked attempts to quantify the benefits of psychotherapy for decades now. That would be psychoanalysis and cognitive behavioral therapy, and there are literally hundreds of different kinds of talk therapy available out there, and it's extremely difficult to assess them scientifically because there is so much variety, and it's hard to know even what is making talk therapy effective, if it's effective at all. It's hard to quantify whether people are really feeling better or not. And the literature has actually shown that all talk therapies are roughly equivalent to each other in their effectiveness or lack of effectiveness, and that to me is consistent with their benefits coming from the placebo effect. If you think psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral therapy is going to benefit you, it probably will. And that's my takeaway from attempts to quantify the benefits of meditation as well, which is also immensely variable. Right. It's practiced in just countless different ways, and I think to the extent that it is making people less depressed and less anxious and so forth, it is also probably harnessing the placebo effect.
And that's interesting for a variety of reasons, including, I think from reading your work, I think your mind may work this way. I know mine does, which is, okay, we are as a society, exaggerating the scientific benefit of meditation. What does that say about us as a society? In other words, why, you talk about your own experience meditating. I have which sounds similar to my own, by the way, which is, but why does it have to be, and I'm posing this as a question to you that we can explore together, but why does it, and we're talking with John Horgan, author, why does it have to be functional or utilitarian? Why does it have to have a medicinal effect in order to be just something people like to do?
Well, Americans are practical people, and they're always looking for an edge on everybody else out there. And I think meditation is being sold in that way now. It's why it is so immensely popular, especially among corporations now.
Right.
I mean, that's part of the story of the popularity of meditation now, and a lot of companies are encouraging their employees to start meditating and presenting, offering programs and so forth. The way I consider myself, going back to the 60s, I'm fascinated with mysticism, with these experiences
Right.
that we can sometimes have through meditation or yoga or psychedelics or lots of different ways where we suddenly, the scales fall from our eyes and we have a view of reality that we don't get ordinarily, or that's blocked by all these chores that we have to get through day after day. And suddenly we have these glimpses of what it really means to be alive. That, to me, isn't something that's necessarily going to make you less anxious or happier or better employee or even a better father or husband or a better citizen. But to me, it's one of the most precious experiences that you can have. You realize what a miracle it is to be alive. That's what I look to in meditation, to try to cultivate that sort of feeling. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with all these medical benefits that a lot of people are chasing after.
And I might flip that around a little bit too, John Horgan, and say that mystics and prophets, whatever you want to, whether you want to describe them in secular or not context, have traditionally, as far as I understand it, come to upset or trouble the social order, if anything, not to optimize it for maximum efficiency. So I guess that gets to the question of the socioeconomic value of Google or anybody else saying, well, in other words, is part of this an attempt to use meditation, even the placebo effect of meditation or the act of meditating itself, a tool for making people better cogs in a corporate machine that, frankly, maybe ought to be changed?
Absolutely. Listen, the worst example of this is that mindfulness has now become very popular among the armed services. So the Army has a program that is now costing taxpayers more than $100 million to teach soldiers mindfulness, to make them more emotionally resilient. That's the phrase that's used, resilient. And so here you clearly have an example of meditation being put in the service of an endeavor that could be construed as being highly unethical and immoral.
Yeah, and what, as you were talking, John, what came to mind is, I write a lot for Tricycle, the Buddhist magazine, and what comes to mind, for example, is a work of Brian Victoria, who wrote Zen at War, which you may be familiar with, who studied the role of Zen practice and Zen Buddhist teachers in the Japanese war effort during World War II, up to and leading to World War II. Are you familiar with that whole area of inquiry or that particular book?
I'm not, but I know that some of my Western friends who are Buddhists or claim to be Buddhists sometimes talk about Buddhism as the one religion that is almost always nonviolent, and that is just not so. And it sounds as though this author you're mentioning is providing lots of examples of that.
We're talking with, I'm sorry, I'll just do a quick intro here again. We're talking with John Horgan, author of Rational mysticism. I will also tell you, by the way, that I was on a panel with Sam Harris, the atheist writer, who made the same assertion, and I pointed out that, as I recall correctly, it's not at the top 5 Buddhist countries in terms of population included China, Laos, Burma, a lot of countries with a history, Vietnam and so on, with Cambodia, countries which, however wonderful their cultures, do have a history of war. So I'm not sure that's a defensible assertion.
Well, the Sri Lankan government,
Sri Lanka is another.
Is largely Buddhist, and it carried out one of the most brutal campaigns against an uprising in modern history. So that it's totally fallacious to say that Buddhism or meditation in general somehow make people better. This is another one of the claims that is often made for meditation, that it makes you a nicer person, a more moral person. And as somebody who grew up in the 60s, I have just seen countless examples of gurus who supposedly are master meditators and are living almost permanently within these deep mystical states, who are sociopaths, who are bullies, and they're greedy bastards.
Right, and not to mention sexual predators.
Right.
Now, John Horgan, before we turn this into the Buddhist bashing hour, that's certainly not the intention here. Of course, I mean, there's a lot of beauty in the Buddhist tradition. There are a lot of wonderful people in it, and I think both you and I do dip into the meditation pool from time to time, I suspect. But I think where we're going with all this, and tell me if you agree, I think where we're going with all of this is that to a certain extent it's kind of a blank screen as a cultural and social and economic artifact. I think it's time to realize, particularly for the subcultures that venerate it, that meditation is kind of a blank screen on which we can project our own values, but we need to understand that that's what we're doing, that if we're saying it makes you a better corporate employee, we're not really venerating meditation, we're venerating corporate employment. Or if it makes you a better warrior, and as far as the scientific, I think sometimes I've gone to Buddhist conferences where I think at one I said that, we were worshiping the graven image of our own fMRI, printout, well, it's scientific, so it must be real. Anything to that, you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Listen, if I have a spiritual path, a kind of ideology, it would be skepticism, I guess. It seems to me that the essence of the spiritual experience is tearing away things, tearing away beliefs and ideologies, and trying to see things as they really are, which of course is impossible, but it's an ideal that we can approach. And I see this irony in the way that meditation, particularly when it's embedded within belief systems like Buddhism, is becoming something that actually blocks perception. It's so weighted down with beliefs and claims and so forth that I think it has the opposite outcome of certainly what I'm seeking when I meditate or I engage in any kind of spiritual system, which is to try to get rid of all that bullshit.
Right. And don't worry, we'll bleep out that word, but we're pre-recording. But yes, no, I understand. And okay, let's just explore one more area. John Horgan, author of Rational Mysticism. I think a lot in my off hours mostly about this conflict between rationalism and religiosity, for lack of a better term. And I'm wondering, I've had this intuitive feeling for a long time, maybe from too much meditating, that that there is a level of perception on which that seeming contradiction ceases to exist. In other words, you know, okay, look, it's kind of metaphor and beyond metaphor, and whether you love Jesus or whether you're a rationalist or whether it's Krishna or the Buddhist conception of no soul or whatever, that at the end of it, there's really, for me, and maybe I wonder if this dovetails with why you do this stuff. I like to get to the point where that all kind of collapses into a single point, and it doesn't really matter anymore. Do you know what I'm driving at? I'm not really. It's hard to put into words, but
absolutely. Listen, I wrote a whole book, Rational Mysticism, as an attempt to find out where, if anywhere, spirituality and rationality overlap. And rationality would include science. I'm a science journalist, and so I see science as our most powerful way of understanding the world and even understanding ourselves, but it's very limited.
Right.
And so we have these other ways of knowing the world. Religion and literature and so forth. The only common ground that I really see between science and religion is that science, I think, has demonstrated that the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of Homo sapiens were almost infinitely improbable events.
Right.
And a definition of an infinitely improbable event is a miracle. And so, and to me, the mystical experiences, spiritual, religious experiences, whatever you want to call them, their essence is seeing and feeling in a visceral way just how miraculous it is that we're here at all.
Well, do I get to say amen at this point?
Sure. Okay.
Listen, I think that's a great way to put it. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but I hope you'll come back and talk to us again. I've really enjoyed the conversation. John Horgan is the director of the Center for Science Writings at the Stevens Institute of Technology, author of a number of excellent books, including Rational Mysticism. John, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
You bet. I am Richard RJ Eskow. We will be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour.